Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, Editor-in-Chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our live show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. Today I'm talking to Sinem Adar, an associate at the Center for Applied Turkey Studies, also known as the CATS Network, which is part of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, which is also SWP. Thanks for joining us, Sinem.
Thank you, Diego, for having me.
And they're never going to shorten your title, right?
No.
You're stuck with it. Got it. We'll wait to see if they condense. In this podcast, we're going to talk about the PKK and Turkey peace talks, the progress they've made or not, and what that means for the actors involved. We aim to talk about 35 minutes and welcome questions from the live audience. So let's get right into it. The Turkish government and the PKK-linked groups are telling us that this peace process is entering its second phase. It's been ongoing more or less publicly for about a year. And they say that initial steps have been taken on the PKK side. They say there's been the disarming ceremony in July, which was, 30 people, but it was a symbol that they were initiating the disarming process. And just last month, the PKK announced it would withdraw from Turkey. On the government side, they've made this parliamentary peace commission, and they're going to meet again tomorrow, potentially to discuss a visit to Imralı Island, where commission members might meet with PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. And just before we went live, Erdogan spoke in Turkish parliament saying that this process is on a new crossroads and we're taking steps to, progress a terror-free Turkey, which is what they say in the Turkish rhetoric. So how do you see these steps, and do you believe that we're entering a new stage in these peace negotiations?
Thank you, Diego, for having me. It's hard to tell, right? Because since from the beginning, this whole process has been kind of full of unknowns, to a certain extent also lacks transparency. So we are left with kind of like guesswork, just kind of looking at the statements coming from different actors, etc. Having said that, I think there has been, events have been unfolding, not only in Turkey, but also in Syria, which I think is an important component of the whole process of what I call rapprochement with Abdullah Öcalan / the PKK. And if you look at the pro-government media and the statements of the government officials in the last 10 days after the PKK's announcement that it would withdraw the remaining fighters from Turkey, outside of Turkey, the narrative is that now the second phase of this process starts. Whether it's really the case or not, I think this has been an ongoing process. Whether one can talk about the first phase, second phase, third phase, that is not really clear to me. But what is clearer to me based on what we know is that two things, actually. On the one hand, I think one can talk about clear differences between Ankara and the Kurdish actors. And these differences concern the definition of the problem. For Ankara, this is first and foremost an terror problem, quote unquote, a terror problem, whereby for the Kurdish actors, it goes beyond just putting an end to the armed conflict. It is essentially a sociological question and ultimately about extending rights to Turkey's Kurdish citizens. Now, there are also differences, I think, between the actors when it comes to the sequencing of the process. Ankara, I think, has been very consistent since from the beginning that, and in a way also consistent with the ways in which it defines the issue, that first the arms need to be laid down, and then a process, a kind of a new phase, what they call, quote unquote, the democratic Turkey based on brotherhood will start. And I guess that's kind of like within that, they kind of like imagine a constitutional process or changing the constitution, etc. So whereby the Kurdish actors, I think these two processes and bringing the armed conflict to an end and also extending rights to Turkey's Kurdish citizens are intrinsically intertwined with one another. So they are not kind of like two different processes. And I think we have been seeing this more and more so in the last couple of weeks based on the statements coming from different Kurdish actors. And lastly, I think another dimension the difference between Ankara and the Kurdish actors involves the scope of disarmament. For Ankara, this whole process definitely extends to the PKK fighters within Iraq and Syria, so all the affiliates. I'm not sure whether this is a view that is shared by Abdullah Öcalan and the PKK itself. And I think one sees this very clearly in the very most recent interview that Cemil Bayık gave to the France Haber Agency, if I'm not mistaken, where he basically says, and in a way it's a response to what Bahçeli was saying at the beginning of October, that now Abdullah Öcalan should extend the call to YPG in Syria. And Cemil Bayık's response to that is that, yeah, okay, Öcalan is a powerful actor, but at the same time, the autonomous administration in Syria also has a life of its own. So in a way, kind of highlighting the reach of Öcalan when it comes to the disarmament of the YPG. So I'll leave it here. So in that sense, I think it's basically how the process would move on. I think it's basically a question about how these differences among the actors would be kind of like resolved, and if there is a ground for compromise about all these issues.
Yeah, and here in Ankara, many people would say that it's very clear that the peace process extends to Iraq and Syria, but this is a issue of dispute, and we'll loop back to Syria in a few minutes. I just want to cover the domestic developments because this week has all been about Selahattin Demirtaş, the former co-chair of the HDP, and his potential release after the European Court of Human Rights on Monday rejected basically Turkey's appeal for his release. He's been in jail along with the other co-chair of HDP, Figen Yüksekdağ, for 9 years. I think the anniversary was this week now, or maybe today. Forget the exact date. But we've been talking a lot about Demirtaş and what his role is in this peace process, because Öcalan has been the chief negotiator, right, to this point. And now we see Demirtaş back in the news. What do you make of the latest discourse about his potential release, and what could that mean for the peace process?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's kind of, let's go back to the beginning, right? Like you, at the very beginning, like in your introduction, you named some of the steps that were kind of like taken mainly by the PKK, right? The July ceremony in which a group of PKK guerrilla laid down their arms in a kind of like a ceremony. And then basically the announcement from 2 weeks ago where they said that they are withdrawing the remaining fighters outside of Turkey, from Turkey. Now, it is kind of like, to me, clearer both the signals and the steps that PKK has been taking, kind of like in a way to show its goodwill, I think, in the whole process to Ankara. It is, however, less clearer to me, like the concrete steps that Ankara has taken. Here and there, you see basically reports about PKK fighters that are basically imprisoned in Turkey being released. So that's obviously, I think, one kind of like sign that Ankara has been clearly sending to the Kurdish actors that it is serious about this. But now, in this context, I think releasing Demirtaş would obviously be a very important symbolic move. And at this point, I think after especially the PKK's announcement of the withdrawing the remaining fighters from Turkey, Ankara needs to basically take a step, symbolic or not non-symbolic. So the release of Demirtaş, I think in that sense, would make sense as a tactical move. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. And I'm not sure whether anyone would know, mainly because of the fact that I think at the end of the day, Demirtaş is one of the political prisoners that are held hostage by Ankara. And I think this is very closely related to the fact that he is actually, I think, one of the first to challenge President Erdogan's efforts to consolidate power. So if you look at it from that perspective, I wouldn't be surprised if there's no decision to release Demirtaş. But if you look at it from the perspective of the whole rapprochement process with Öcalan and the PKK, then yeah, it would make sense, I think, to at least to gain some time on the side of Ankara, 2-3 months, because I think there was a survey run by the Kurdish Studies Center, which basically says that 2/3 of the surveyed, and they basically surveyed the Kurdish citizens, 2/3 of the survey basically were of the opinion that if Demirtaş is released, that would basically really be read by the Kurdish population as a very positive signal in terms of also kind of strengthening their support for the whole process. But maybe just one point, which is not directly related to Demirtaş. I mentioned at the very beginning the differences between Ankara and the Kurdish actors. Now, I think that's one part of the story. Another part of the story is that there are also differences, and I think sometimes strong differences, not only within Ankara among different regime actors, but also within the Kurdish, I think, political movement. And given these differences, where Demirtaş stands, that is also not entirely clear to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just for some context, because this is an unfolding story, and I'm going to talk, hopefully, to Demirtaş's lawyers after this call, and I'll publish what I get tomorrow. But, some people say he could be released as soon as tonight. Right now, I think Dem Party officials are visiting him in jail, and they're supposed to be giving a speech either now or in a few minutes. This is an unfolding story, and Justice Minister, also just before we went live, was saying that when we get the court documents, we're going to assess them. As for Erdogan, he says we're going to follow whatever our judicial system says, right? So they are making a formal process. I don't know what that means. It could be multi-stepped. Osman Kavala is still in jail despite a long process there, right? And then, like you say, there's no way to understand what could happen, but anything could happen, which makes it more confusing from my point of view, at least. And you're right to point out the differences in the Kurdish process. At the same time, we have developments with the MHP and AKP, the ruling alliance, where we have this constant debate and about the rumors in Ankara, whether there's cohesion between Erdogan and MHP chair Devlet Bahçeli on this process, and whether Bahçeli's, let's say, non-appearance, no-show in last week's Republic Day ceremony was a slight towards Erdogan and over some disagreement. What do you make over the ruling alliance stance and messaging on this peace process? And how important is it to have that alignment between the AKP-MHP in regards to the peace process success?
Mm-hmm. Look, I think I have a little bit of a minority view on this since from the beginning, because the narrative or the interpretation has been that there is a significant difference between the two actors, between President Erdogan and Bahçeli, about the process, and that basically the evidence for that was basically the fact that President Erdogan has entered the kind of the theater, so to speak, rather late. Yeah. So it was kind of like started by Devlet Bahçeli and then carried also out by Devlet Bahçeli. I'm not sure whether this can be taken as an indication of a significant divergence between the two actors, because when you kind of look at the statements, actually starting on October 1st, 2024, the opening speech that Erdogan delivered in the Turkish parliament, the opening of the new legislative year, I think that was pretty much in alignment with the statements later coming from Bahçeli and other government officials. So I think that, as I said, since from the beginning, I'm of the opinion that these two actors are actually aligned when it comes to the necessity to start such a process, and that necessity is primarily, I think, driven in terms of its timing, driven by the regional developments in the aftermath of October 7, but also kind of like converging with some domestic political goals, issues, motivations, interests, etc. Now, this doesn't mean that the two actors are completely aligned. I'm sure there are differences among the two when it comes to again, at the very beginning, I mentioned the sequencing of the process. I think there might be some some differences between the two, how the sequencing should be implemented. And for instance, there might also be differences in terms of whether it makes sense to kind of like, on the one hand, there is this so-called reform process going on with the Kurdish actors, but at the same time, there is a very accelerated repression going against the CHP. Whether it's a good idea or not, there might be differences when it comes to these kind of secondary issues, so to speak, between the two actors. But overall, I think they are pretty much aligned. And perhaps one thing related to that, I think the fact that this whole process was initiated by Devlet Bahçeli was kind of a tactic in line with the larger strategy, right? Because if you go back to the 2024 local elections, I think about a month before the elections, there is an interview conducted with Ahmet Türk in one of the newspapers. And there he basically makes a point about, we are basically, as the Kurdish actors, are open to kind of take the peace process from the defreeze the peace process. But of course, and we are willing to do that with any actor. But at the end of the day, today, the keys of the state are in the hands of Erdogan. So that's why we will basically do this with them. And then, of course, if you remember, when Bahçeli made that call, the conversation was that, Bahçeli kind of like has a stark interest in keeping the continuity of the Turkish state. And at the end of the day, he represents the Turkish state interest. So it's different from the government. And that's why actually this is very serious. This is different from the previous phases. So I think that's why kind of like Bahçeli was the initiator of this process. And Erdogan kind of came to the game later, because I think one thing, in my opinion, that is often neglected in the interpretations is the very style in which President Erdogan conducts politics in the last couple of years. I mean, it was also there before, but I think in the last couple of years, it is more and more based on a dual use of loyalty and domination test. I think he only kind of entered the game once that ceremony in Iraq happened and this small group of PKK guerrilla laid down their arms. So in a way, kind of like, okay, they did what we asked them to do. So now, he could kind of like get into the game. How, like you asked, the second part of your question was like how important it is for the AKP and MHP to be on the same page for the peace process to continue. I think it is important, given that although obviously the government is run by the AKP, but MHP also holds quite an important stake, I think, in overall in running the system. So in that sense, I think it's important, and I think they are aligned on the contours of the whole process.
So the alliance is not going to fall apart anytime soon, on the peace process at least. Talking about domination, which you referred to, we need to talk about CHP and the crackdown that's been going on the main opposition party in Turkey. Özgür Özel yesterday said in Parliament that he apologized for lifting the immunities on the HDP politicians like Demirtaş, and has been very supportive of the peace process overall. But on a split screen, you see CHP getting new court investigations all the time. İmamoğlu, the Istanbul mayor, is in jail. And on the other side, you have potential democratic opening with the Kurdish movement. How do you view this dynamic, and what do you make of Özgür Özel's leadership throughout these developments?
Mm-hmm. I think that this dual process, basically the one that's taking place with the Kurdish actors and the other one that's kind of like the legal warfare, so to speak, against the CHP, I see them intrinsically related to one another. And I see them as parts of the same kind of strategic approach on the side of Ankara. And that has to do with the fact that I think when it comes to the rapprochement with the Kurdish actors, I think as important as the outcome that Turkey wants to gain from this process is also very important. And by that, I mean the following: the process in terms of the kind of recalibrating, reshifting the political landscape within Turkey. And the connectedness or the connection, the strong connection between the two processes, the one that's taking place with the Kurdish actors and the legal warfare against the CHP, I think kind of essentially has aimed to distance the CHP and then part it from one another. And the background to that is, of course, the work, quite, I think, working, the cooperation during the election times, and the basically one concrete result of that is, of course, the 2024 local elections, and the CHP after 52 years basically gained the first party status, etc., etc. So that's, I think, kind of like that has been one of the intentions of having this the two processes at the same time. And perhaps another kind of goal of it was also because, in a way, like the DEM party is really stuck in a rock in a hard place, right? In the sense that, okay, there is a process that is going on towards bringing the armed conflict to an end. If it is, let's say, the DEM party that kind of like it's very difficult, I think, for the DEM party to kind of to be seen as the actor that would be responsible for instance, blocking the whole process, right? Because kind of like what's happening to the CHP, not that they didn't face it before, they have been facing it for decades, but I think that's kind of like okay, if you don't play along, that's basically what would happen to you. So that's, I think, kind of like the second motivation behind having these two processes simultaneously on play. Now, you asked me also about the Özgür Özel's leadership style. I mean, I find him, especially after the imprisonment of Ekrem İmamoğlu, actually quite courageous. And in a way, the statement that he made yesterday in the Turkish parliament also kind of like fits into that picture. I think he has been bold in the sense that, like, he clearly has made a decision that I'm not gonna play this loyalty test and the domination test that the President Erdogan and the government wants to play with the CHP, and I'm gonna kind of like stay strong. And in that context, I think he also it was a good decision to join the commission, because I think, in a way, the decision to join the commission is one decision that kind of, if the intention of Ankara was to create distance between CHP and them, I think the decision to join the commission was, in a way, kind of rendered that to a certain extent void. So in that sense, I overall find, and in a way, like what he said yesterday in the parliament, going back to the very beginning, what I said about this definition of the problem. So in a way, he's kind of like constantly reminding, I think, the political, the audience, so to speak, that this is not only about bringing the armed conflict to an end. Like, we also did mistakes in the past in terms of Kurdish rights, Kurdish political representation, etc. So there is a bigger problem than the terror, quote unquote, the terror problem. So in that sense, I find his leadership style actually refreshing.
Yeah. And in my rush to start this podcast, I forgot to say my usual disclosure, which is that my wife is an MP with Dem Party, and the audience should know that. Apologies for not mentioning it up top. To move on to Syria, what do you make of developments in Syria? Because it looks like after the March 10th agreement to integrate the SDF, which is Kurdish-led, with the Damascus government, it looks like we got some news last week that they will make some efforts to integrate somehow different units of the SDF. Do you think that this is a sign of progress also in Syria? And how do you see developments there? Because anything could happen also in Syria, instability-wise, or with different armed groups. How do you see developments there potentially impacting what happens here in Ankara and with the peace process?
I think since from the beginning, what happens in Syria is a very crucial component of the whole process, the rapprochement process with Öcalan and the PKK. And as I said, I think for Ankara, the whole question of disarmament definitely extends to YPG as well. And that's why, in my opinion, and to a certain extent, I think there is some discomfort and discontent that the whole disarmament process, first and foremost, has not yet happened in Syria. And second, the whole process of integration of the SDF to SDG, the Syrian transitional government, I think has been going much slower than Ankara would wish to see. So in that sense, there are kind of like points of discontent. And you could see this like in the writings of some pro-government journalists in the last couple of months. And also the call made by Bahçeli, right, at the beginning of October to Öcalan to extend his call from February to YPG in Syria. And again, what he also said yesterday in the parliament, because at the end, I think so that's one issue. The second issue, I think, for Ankara is that the question of integration of SDF to the like the Syrian National Army. But there, I think I see I think there might be a little bit of a shift in Ankara's position, which the government's position that might not necessarily supported by all the regime actors. And that means the following. I think at the beginning, Ankara was supporting integration of SDF to the Syrian National Army as individuals, right? The PKK affiliates within the SDF would basically lay down their arms and then they would leave Syria, and whoever remains in SDF would integrate into the Syrian National Army as individuals without their weapons, etc., etc. Now, over time, especially even though there was an agreement between SDF and the SDG on March 10, I think first the violent incidences in the coastal areas in May, if I'm not mistaken, and then what happened in Sweden kind of changed the balance of power, in my opinion, in favor of the SDF. In Syria. And that basically meant kind of like a shift that changed, I think, the ways in which the whole integration issue in Syria has been discussed. It shifted it from integration at the individual level to integration at the group level, so to speak. And that, of course, the big discussion, I think, whether we mean by group a division or a unit. And it seems to me that the meetings that SDF and the Syrian transitional government had in the month of October kind of revolved around this issue. And I'm not sure whether there is any consensus emerged from it. But Bahçeli's statement yesterday in the parliament, that was a very clear rejection of the integration of SDF to the Syrian National Army as units. So that I found interesting, but I think we need to kind of like wait and see in terms of like how the developments in Syria would evolve. But related to, I think, the disarmament issue, another aspect that seems to be important for Ankara is that withdrawal of the SDF from areas that are majority Arab populated, such as Deir ez-Zor, Hasaka, Raqqa, etc., etc. And of course, these areas are the areas also with resources. So I think kind of like it's a very complicated picture. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, and it looks to me that it is definitely taking longer than how Ankara envisioned this. And it seems to continue, in a way, it seems to basically take more time as well. But definitely what happens in Syria, I think, would a significant influence on the whole process in Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, just speaking to diplomats here, they've become more optimistic on the peace process based on the Syria dynamics, just from different conversations I've had recently. So it's interesting to see the shift, because those people that are optimistic now were not at all optimistic last year. Let's see where things go. Before we end, I have to also ask about Israel, which is the other big, state with a big military on the other side of Syria. And there's been a lot of discussion about Turkish-Israel influence in Syria and what both states would like to see within Syria in the future. How do you see the Turkish-Israeli relations impacting developments in the peace process? And I ask this because the peace process from the start seems to have been linked to the Israel war in Gaza, and different versions of conspiracy theories where Israel would ally with Kurdish forces and do this grand war against Turkey. So we need to resolve this issue now. Otherwise, we're going to have problems in the future. Those were the discussions here. I don't know how real they are, but that's the rhetoric. What do you make of Israel's role in all this?
I'm not sure whether Israel has a direct role in all of this. I think the kind of like the point where kind of the whole Israel-Turkey rivalry might be connected to the the rapprochement process that is going on in Turkey is actually the Syria dimension that we talked earlier, right? Because there you see two countries which are, to a certain extent, very similar when it comes to their permanent security aspirations and the search for, like, constant search for security, keeping their borders secure. Yeah, for Israel, this is obviously it's southern, like the Syria southern border that's directly concerns Israel. And in the case of Turkey, it's Syria's northern border. Both countries actually have a very strong interest in keeping these borders respectively secure. And it's almost like it's kind of an ontological insecurity, right? And so in this context, I think the kind of their similarity is also their difference, or their similarity is the cause of their tension, so to speak, in Syria. And that means the following. Of course, for Israel to keep its border with Syria secure, what has it been demanding? Has been demanding basically a demilitarized zone and quite an extensive area at Syria's southern border. But the minute basically that demand comes up, that kind of like is also associated with a discussion about the future of the minorities in Syria, but whether kind of like Syria is going to be able to maintain a unified, centralized government, etc. All of the questions that actually trigger Turkey's security anxieties at its border with Syria. So in that sense, I think that's kind of like the one tension trigger point among the two countries. Having said that, I mean, and of course, they both have kind of a certain, I think, aspiration in terms of shaping the Middle East. I'm not sure whether basically those aspirations for both countries would be fulfilled, etc. But I think that's another kind of like point of tension between the two. Having said and perhaps the third dimension, and then I will conclude with one sentence. And of course, the relationship between the two countries, like 2025, is by no means 1990. In the 1990s, these two countries were strategic partners. I think that era is over. And given that era is over, I think that's another kind of like dimension that makes the divergence between the two countries easier, so to speak. But having said that, there has also been, especially Turkey has been, I think, quite cautious when it comes to its reactions, even though like the rhetoric is very heated, etc. For instance, when Israel hits the air bases that Turkey has an eye on clearly in Syria, Turkish response was surprisingly mild. And then the whole discussion about the deconflicting mechanism in Syria, etc., which basically tells me that, I mean, the two countries, despite all their differences, are also trying to make it work. And clearly here, I think the elephant in the room is the US. The US, of course, also kind of, I think, pushing the two countries to act in that way. And I guess I will leave it there.
Yeah. And I know we can't predict anything, but are you looking for something specific in the coming weeks or months that might be able to tell us where this process is heading with the PKK in Turkey, aside from Demirtaş's release?
What I'm curious is whether there is going to be a visit at İmralı by some members of the parliamentary commission, because I think that would be a signal sent by Ankara to the Kurdish actors. And of course, I mean, we talked about this at length, like Syria, the developments in Syria, how, if you remember, the US envoy to Syria and also the ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barrack, at some point said that until the end of this year, we want basically this integration to be over. I'm not sure whether that timeline clearly rhetorically is still on the table, but I'm not sure that timeline is realistic. But that's definitely one of the things that I personally will be watching. And as you mentioned, of course, whether Demirtaş will be released or not, that would also, I think, be not necessarily in terms of like the future success of the peace process, but in terms of Ankara's willingness, even if at the tactical level, to send kind of like a positive signal to the Turkish Kurdish counterparts.
Yeah. And I would just add what his release conditions are. Maybe he'll have a political ban, right? So a lot to keep watching, but things are happening. And I really appreciate this talk. I've been speaking to Sinem Adar, an associate with the Center for Applied Turkey Studies in the German Institute for International Security Affairs. Did I get that right? Almost. Katz Network SWP. I'll link to the profile profile so people can see your analysis, which I really recommend. Also, please follow Sinem on Blue Sky or Twitter, where she's very active and very insightful on Turkish developments, especially in the peace process. For listeners that missed part of this live show, you can find the full recording on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I'll add a bunch of stuff in the show notes for people that are interested in learning more. And this podcast is a production of Turkey Recap, a newsletter on Turkish politics, foreign affairs, and business. Visit turkeyrecap.com for more coverage from right here in Ankara. Stay safe, stay well, and thank you again.
Thank you, Diego. And thank you for joining us, to everyone who joined.